Joe Grease. What is the clay table processing on the Pro TRs course? Okay, this is an interesting thing, and this is a little bit of Scientology, not minutia exactly, because it's a mainline service that almost all Scientologists do, but it's a little weird. Okay, so for those of you who don't know anything about this, let's see. Let's start from the Pro TRs course. What does that mean? It's the Professional Training Routines course. TR stands for Training Routines or Training Regimens, and those are the drills that they do in order to learn how to communicate. Okay, that's basically it. There's 5 drills: TR0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And TR0 is divided into 3 drills. It's TR0, there's OT TR0, TR0, and TR0 bull bait. Okay. Kind of walked through those TRs before. They're just drills in communicating, okay? So I'm not going to necessarily break all those down right now. We're going to talk about the clay table processing that was made part of this course in 1990. At the end of 1990 is when this was released into the world of Scientology. Hubbard had actually developed it and worked out what it was going to be back in 1979. He made a film for this course showing how to do these drills, but he also showed in the film how to do this clay table processing. But none of us knew what the hell they were showing us, except a bunch of people making stuff with clay, and we were like, what's this? Because it wasn't yet part of the course until it was released in 1990. I first did the course in 1985. So, in Santa Barbara. So anyway, when this stuff was released, I was a staff member. I went down to LA. I specifically trained on how to do it, and then I went back to Santa Barbara and I delivered this new part of the Pro TRs course. So from that point on, you would start the course, you would do a bunch of theory study where you would read a bunch of stuff about L. Ron Hubbard's ideas about communication. And then before you did the TR drills where you're sitting there staring at each other for hours on end and trying to push each other's buttons and on all of that stuff that we've talked about ad infinitum, before you would get into those drills, you do the clay table processing. Now, processing in Scientology is another word for auditing, addressing stress, trauma, difficulties unresolved from your past that are affecting you now is a summary way of saying what auditing is. It's actually not, it's not an effective way of doing that, and it doesn't produce the results people are told it does. It does something. What it does is kind of interesting to different people. And it often creates a euphoric state, which is why people can get semi-addicted to it. And then they keep putting the money down. And that's Scientology's claim to fame. So clay table processing is where instead of sitting on the meter and being asked questions and answering them, or instead of standing and being walked around a room or being told to pick things up, which is objective auditing, instead of that, it's clay table auditing, where you take your thoughts in response to a command or a question, and you put them in clay. You actually make a clay representation of what you're thinking is the answer to this question. So let's say, for example, you're asked, make a clay, and these are called clay representations to differentiate them from clay demonstrations, which is what's done in study. I've talked about this in videos before, where you make clay figures and clay concepts and you lay it all out in clay in 3 dimensions so you can show that you understand some principle in Scientology. That's a clay demonstration. A clay representation is a representation of something in your mind that answers the auditing question. Now, I didn't look up, and I don't remember right off the top of my head all of the various parts of the clay table processing that are done on the Pro TRs course, but I can tell you there are 5 parts to it, 5 distinct steps, each one of which has its own specific end result, which the person has to somehow voice before they'll finish that section. So you start on section 1, and let's say there are 3 or 4 different commands in section 1 that have you making clay representations of, if I remember right, like affinity or reality or communication, right? Like make a clay representation of a time you had affinity or something. I mean, like I said, I probably should have looked the commands up first, but it's something like this. It has to do with the ARC triangle, and then Then the next section has to do with the KRC triangle, knowledge, responsibility, and control. And then the next clay representation section has to do with cycles of action and time, where you're starting, stopping, continuing things. And then I don't remember the last two. The last one had to do with communication itself. You had to actually put a full communication in clay with all its parts. And Hubbard has like 20 different parts to communication. Okay, for example, it's not just you saying something to somebody. It's you are cause. The person you're talking to is effect. So you have two parts. You have cause and you have effect. And then you have a distance between them. However small, there's always a distance between them. So it's cause, distance, effect. The person communicating has intention to communicate. They intend to communicate something. And they have attention. They are paying attention to the person they're communicating to in some fashion, right? They're looking at him, or somehow they have some attention, right? So there's cause, distance, effect with intention, attention, duplication, because the person who's receiving the communication has to duplicate it, and thereby understand it. Okay, so these are just different parts, and there's a whole bunch of other parts too. And all of them go into clay as part of doing this. The idea with clay representations is that you are taking something, communication difficulties or problems or issues you've had in the past, and you're putting them in clay, and the auditor and the supervisor, there's a supervisor who comes around and checks it out. And he just looks at it and says, well, here's what I see. And if what he sees is an accurate description of what you were trying to show, then you get to carry on. If it's not, if he can't see it, if he goes, well, I don't really get what's going on here exactly. It looks like the mom is yelling at the kid, but then the kid is turning around and running away, and I don't really see what's, is this supposed to be communicated? I don't know. I'm not quite tracking with what's happening. And if he can't see it, then the person who's doing the clay representation has to fix it or adjust it so that he can. Probably not a really good idea in therapy, but this isn't therapy, this is Scientology. Let's be clear about that. So, person has to make their adjustments, and then the supervisor comes back over and looks at it and gives it a pass or whatever, and then they move on to the next step. And this goes, and they repeat these steps until, like I said, at each of these 5 parts, there is a specific end result that is being looked for. And I think the last one was something about being able to communicate, whenever you want. But there were other things, like, for example, the third part I remember had something to do with time. It had to do with, like, you could be cause over time through how you are aware of what are called cycles of action in Scientology, right? Start, change, stop. So you can create time through this, being aware of cause, distance, effect or something. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, well, in retrospect, it doesn't make any sense to me either. But at the time it did, but now I look back on it and I just go, that doesn't reconcile at all. What can I say? Some of these things just can't be explained well, at least not by me at this point. But that kind of thing. And again, you have to say it out loud or write it down in a success story. So you're often asked during the course of doing this clay table processing, let's say you do a representation, and then, oh yeah, that's right, most of the commands were do this representation like of affinity, and then the next command was do a representation of how this applies to you or something, right? And then you're asked if you have any successes to write them down, and you might write a success story. Oh yeah, I can see how I can be closer to people now. Or, oh, I see how my failure to listen to other people has caused communication difficulties. Like there can be honest realizations or epiphanies along the way that can help people out. These don't tend to be rather permanent, though. They tend to be in the moment, right? I mean, you have some guy who goes, oh yeah, I don't listen to people so well. Maybe I should do better at that. And then, a month later, he's like yelling and screaming at you and not listening to a word you say. So that's what I mean when I say these things are kind of, temporary, these successes that people have in Scientology. Anyway, the whole point of the clay table processing was to add another dimension to Hubbard's works and make it more real to the person and come up with other ways from their own life experiences that they could find agreement with different points of Hubbard's assertions or claims so that they would believe him when he said that communication is nothing more than cause, distance, effect with intention, attention, duplication, and understanding. And, it's clearly got into my head because even, 8 years later, I still remember all that stuff pretty clearly. So anyway, that's what clay table processing is.